Tonight, we journey through the ancient machines that once ran in darkness and have now fallen silent. Water clocks that measured hours no one now remembers. Lighthouses that guided ships long since sunk. Automatons that amazed crowds now dust. Each machine a mystery. Each silence a question. Each fragment of bronze and stone a whisper from a world we thought we knew but barely understand. We live surrounded by machines. They hum in our walls, pulse in our pockets, illuminate our nights, and regulate our days. We take for granted their constant operation, their tireless function, their presence so pervasive that we notice only their absence. When the power fails, when the engine stops, when the silence suddenly reminds us how much noise we had ceased to hear, the ancient world had machines too, not like ours, not powered by electricity or fossil fuels, not mass produced or digitally controlled, but machines nonetheless, devices that converted energy into motion, that automated tasks, that extended human capability beyond what bare hands could achieve. Water wheels that ground grain while farmers slept, clocks that measured time while priests attended other duties, mechanisms that opened temple doors as if by magic, that poured wine without human touch, that tracked the movements of celestial bodies through systems of gears and dials. These machines are mostly silent now. The water wheels have stopped turning. The clocks have ceased measuring. The temple doors no longer open to fire's heat. The mechanisms that amazed ancient crowds have corroded into fragments that puzzle modern scholars. The silence has lasted centuries, millennia in some cases, long enough that we forgot the machines existed, long enough that their rediscovery seemed impossible, long enough that finding them felt like encountering visitors from a future that somehow arrived in the past. Tonight, we enter this world of ancient machines. We examine the devices that once ran in the darkness of temples and workshops, in the depths of ships and the heights of towers. We trace the ingenuity that created them, the purposes they served, the knowledge they embodied, and we sit with the silence that eventually claimed them, the cessation of motion, the end of function, the stillness that falls when machines stop running and no one remembers how to start them again. This is not a story of progress, of steady advancement from primitive to sophisticated. The ancient machines we will encounter were not steps toward our machines. They were achievements in themselves, complete in their own terms, serving purposes their makers understood, and we can only partially reconstruct. Some of these machines represented knowledge that would be lost for centuries, that would have to be independently rediscovered, that we still do not fully understand despite our technological advantages. The ancient world was not waiting for us to improve upon it. It was solving its own problems with its own resources, achieving results that sometimes exceeded what we might expect and sometimes exceeded what we ourselves could easily replicate. The machines also remind us of impermanence. Every machine eventually stops. Every mechanism eventually fails. The most sophisticated device, maintained by the most skilled technicians, will someday fall silent through neglect or catastrophe, through the simple entropy that claims all ordered systems, through the withdrawal of the knowledge and resources needed to keep it running. Our machines will someday be as silent as the water clocks of Babylon, as still as the automata of Alexandria, as mysterious to future peoples as the Antikythera mechanism is to us. So let the evening deepen. Let the hum of modern machines fade into background. Let us enter the workshops and temples of the ancient world, where machines once ran in darkness and have now been silenced by time. The gears are still. The water has ceased flowing. The bronze is green with centuries of oxidation, but the machines remain, and their silence speaks of a world we are only beginning to understand. Come, the ancient engines await. In the spring of 1900, sponge divers working off the coast of the small Greek island of Antikythera discovered a shipwreck. The vessel had gone down sometime around 70 BCE, carrying luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean toward Rome, bronze and marble statues, glassware, pottery, the treasures of a culture being absorbed by the expanding empire. Among the corroded bronze and encrusted artifacts, the divers brought up a lump of material that seemed unremarkable at first. Just another piece of corroded metal, shaped by 2,000 years of salt water into something unrecognizable. It was not until months later, when the lump cracked open in the Athens Museum, that anyone realized what had been found. Inside the corrosion were gears, bronze gears, precisely cut, interlocking with other gears, part of a mechanism whose complexity defied everything scholars thought they knew about ancient technology. The Antikythera mechanism had returned from the depths, bringing with it questions that would take a century to begin answering. The device is roughly the size of a shoebox. Its bronze gears, at least 30 of them in the surviving fragments, mesh with precision that would be remarkable in any era. That seems almost impossible for the ancient world. The gears are cut with triangular teeth, carefully calibrated, designed to turn in ratios that correspond to astronomical cycles. The mechanism tracked the movements of the sun and moon, predicted eclipses, may have tracked planetary positions, may have calculated the timing of the Olympic Games. It was, in essence, an analog computer, a device that used mechanical motion to model celestial movements, that compressed the mathematics of the heavens into bronze wheels turning in a wooden case. Nothing like it survives from the ancient world. Nothing like it was known to exist until this single specimen emerged from the sea. The mechanism suggests that ancient Greeks possessed technical capabilities far beyond what their written records indicate, capabilities that created this device, and then, somehow, were lost, were not transmitted, were not preserved in the texts that survived antiquity. The, me- the mechanism is an orphan, singular, alone in its sophistication, raising questions about what else might have existed and not survived. Who made it? We do not know. The leading theory attributes it to workshops connected to the tradition of Archimedes, that mathematical genius who designed war machines and discovered principles of buoyancy and leverage, who was killed by a Roman soldier during the siege of Syracuse, who left no direct heirs to his mechanical knowledge. The mechanism may represent the pinnacle of a tradition that died with its masters, that was not written down in forms that survived, that existed in the hands and minds of craftsmen rather than in text that could be copied and preserved. What was it for? This question has clearer answers, though not complete ones. The mechanism tracked the metonic cycle, the 19-year period after which lunar phases recur on the same dates. It tracked the Saros cycle, the 18-year period that predicts eclipses. It modeled the irregular motion of the moon with a gear system that compensates for the moon's varying speed as it orbits Earth. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the mechanism is sophisticated, is accurate, is practical for anyone needing to predict celestial events. For religious festival tied to lunar calendar, for navigation dependent on celestial observation, for the simple human desire to know what will happen in the sky. The mechanism's users would have turned a handle on the side, rotating the internal gears, moving the dials that displayed on the front and back faces. As they turned, they could see the future, not through mystical vision, but through mathematical modeling, the gears converting rotational motion into predictions of where celestial bodies would be on any given date. The device made the patterns of heaven accessible, made astronomical knowledge portable, compressed generations of observation into a box that could be carried aboard ship, and it was being carried aboard ship when disaster struck. The vessel went down. Storm or accident or piracy, we cannot know. Taking its cargo to the bottom, taking the mechanism into darkness where it would wait for 2,000 years. The salt water began its slow work. The bronze began to corrode. The delicate gears fused together. The moving parts became fixed. The machine that had modeled heaven's motion ceased to move at all. In the darkness of the Aegean deep, the Antikythera mechanism fell silent. The silence lasted longer than the machine had run. Whoever built it, whoever commissioned it, whoever understood its workings, whoever would have repaired it when gears wore or alignments drifted, these people died without passing on their knowledge, or passed it to others who died without passing it further. The chain of transmission broke. The technical tradition ended. By the time Rome fell and the medieval period began, no one in Europe could have built such a device. No one knew such devices had existed. No one imagined that ancient Greeks had possessed such mechanical sophistication. The rediscovery has been slow. For decades after its recovery, the mechanism was studied by scholars who could not quite believe what they were seeing, who proposed explanations that now seem inadequate, who lacked the imaging technology to see inside the corroded mass. It was not until X-ray analysis in the 1970s and advanced CT scanning in the 2000s that the mechanism's true complexity became apparent, that scholars could count the gears, trace the gear trains, reconstruct the astronomical functions, understand what the ancient craftsmen had achieved. What we have learned is humbling. The mechanism represents mathematical and mechanical knowledge that we associate with much later periods, with the astronomical clocks of medieval Europe, with the scientific instruments of the Renaissance, with the precision engineering that we imagine emerging from the scientific revolution. But here it is, created more than 2,000 years ago, created by people whose names we do not know, created in a tradition that left the single artifact and then vanished. The mechanism now rests in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, fragments displayed behind glass, the gears visible but motionless, the dials frozen on positions they reached 2 millennia ago. Reconstructions have been built that actually function, that demonstrate the mechanism's capabilities, that turn and track and predict as the original once did. But the original remains silent. Its gears have not turned since some time before the ship went down, since some last user rotated the handle and read the predictions, since the mechanism performed its final calculation and entered the long stillness that would last until our time. We sit with this silence. The mechanism that calculated heaven is still. The gears that modeled celestial motion no longer move. The knowledge that created this device, the mathematical understanding, the mechanical skill, the tradition that made such creation possible, existed and then ceased to exist, leaving only this single orphaned artifact to testify that it was real. What else was lost? The question haunts anyone who contemplates the Antikythera mechanism. If this device existed, what other devices might have existed? If this knowledge was achieved, what other knowledge might have been achieved and then lost? The mechanism is window into a world more sophisticated than we imagined, and reminder that windows can close, that knowledge can vanish, that the most impressive achievements can be forgotten if the chain of transmission breaks. The gears that calculated heaven, the mechanism that modeled the cosmos in bronze, the ancient computer that predicted eclipses and tracked celestial cycles, forever silent now, forever still in its museum case, forever asking questions we cannot fully answer about what the ancient world achieved and what we have lost. The machine that ran in darkness, aboard ship, below deck, in the hands of users whose names are forgotten, and was silenced by time, by shipwreck, by the slow patience of salt water, and the long forgetting that followed. For 600 years, a flame burned at the edge of the sea, rising from the harbor of Alexandria, visible for miles across the Mediterranean. The Pharaoh's lighthouse guided ships toward Egypt's greatest port, toward the grain that fed Rome, toward the library that gathered the world's knowledge, toward the city that Alexander founded and named for himself. The lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, not merely for its height, which was extraordinary, but for its function, for the light it projected, for the technology that made darkness navigable. We cannot see it now. The lighthouse fell through earthquake, through neglect, through the simple accumulation of damage that centuries inflict on even the most massive structures. Its stones were quarried for other buildings, including the medieval fortress that now stands on its site. Its memory persisted in travelers' accounts and in the word itself. Pharos became the term for lighthouse in multiple languages, testimony to the original's fame. But the actual structure is gone, and with it, the technology that produced the legendary light. How did it work? The ancient accounts describe a fire at the summit whose light was magnified and directed by mirrors, bronze mirrors, polished to high reflectivity, curved or angled to project the flame's light toward the sea. The descriptions are impressive, but vague. We do not know exactly how the mirror system functioned, whether it truly could project light the distances claimed, whether the technology was as sophisticated as legend suggests, or whether legend has improved upon reality. The lighthouse was built in the 3rd century BCE during the reign of Ptolemy the same dynasty that created the great library that made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The architect was Sostratus of Cnidus, whose name was inscribed on the structure's base. Beneath a layer of plaster that bore Ptolemy's name, so that when the plaster eventually fell away, the architect's identity would be revealed and remembered. The story may be apocryphal, but it captures something true. The lighthouse was the work of human minds and hands, was achievement of specific people whose fame deserved preservation, was not merely gift from king to city, but creation by craftsmen whose skills made the wonder possible. The structure rose in 3 stages. The lowest was square, massive, rising perhaps 200 feet. The middle section was octagonal, rising another 100 feet. The top was cylindrical, housing the fire and the mirror system that projected its light. Ancient accounts claim the total height exceeded 400 feet, which would make the lighthouse one of the tallest structures in the ancient world, exceeded only by the Great Pyramids. Whether these measurements are accurate or exaggerated, the lighthouse was certainly enormous, was certainly visible from great distances, was certainly the dominant feature of Alexandria's harbor. But height alone did not make the lighthouse wonderful. What made it wonderful was the light, the fire that burned at its summit, tended by workers whose task was to maintain the flame that ships depended on, to feed the fire that represented safety and civilization amid the dark and unpredictable sea. The flame burned by night, and on some accounts suggest the mirrors reflected sunlight by day, maintaining the beacon's visibility through all hours. The lighthouse was machine as much as building, a machine that converted fuel into signal, that transformed fire into navigation, that made the dangerous waters around Alexandria's harbor safe. The light had meaning beyond the practical. It represented Alexandria itself, the city's ambition, the city's wealth, the city's role as center of commerce and learning. Ships approaching from across the Mediterranean would see the light before they saw anything else, would orient toward it, would understand that they were approaching somewhere important, somewhere worth approaching, somewhere the light had been constructed to welcome them. The lighthouse was advertisement, as much as aid to navigation, proclamation of Alexandria's significance, statement that this city could afford to build one of the world's greatest structures and dedicate it to guiding strangers safely to port. The light also had religious meaning. Fire was sacred in many ancient traditions, and the lighthouse's perpetual flame may have carried religious significance, may have been dedicated to gods who protected sailors, may have been tended with rituals we cannot reconstruct, may have represented divine light as much as practical illumination. The lighthouse stood at the boundary between land and sea, between civilization and the vast unpredictable waters, between human order and natural chaos. The light it projected was assertion that human technology could push back darkness, could make the unknown known, could provide orientation where none would otherwise exist. The lighthouse functioned for centuries through Rome's conquest of Egypt and the long centuries of Roman rule, through the rise of Christianity and the closing of pagan temples, through the Arab conquest and the transformation of Alexandria from Greek-speaking metropolis to Islamic city. The light continued burning, the mirrors continued reflecting, the ships continued finding safe harbor. The keepers changed. The language of the city changed. The religion changed. But the function persisted. The lighthouse did what it was built to do, did it generation after generation, became so reliable that people likely ceased to wonder at it, ceased to see it as remarkable, took for granted the light that their ancestors had marveled at. But no structure lasts forever. Earthquakes struck Alexandria repeatedly in the medieval period, significant quakes in 709, 951, 956, 1303, and 1323 CE. Each caused damage, each weakening the structure that had stood for 1,500 years. The lighthouse fell in stages, its upper sections collapsing first, its lower sections following, its stones tumbling into the harbor or being carried away for other construction. By the time the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay built his fortress on the site in 1480, the lighthouse was already memory, its stones incorporated into the fortress walls, its location marked, but its structure gone. Underwater archaeology has recovered some of what the sea claimed. Divers exploring the harbor have found massive blocks of stone, fragments of statues, pieces that almost certainly came from the lighthouse, submerged remains of one of the ancient world's greatest structures. The fragments offer tantalizing glimpses, but cannot restore what has been lost. The lighthouse's true form, its precise dimensions, its technical systems, these remain uncertain, reconstructed from ancient descriptions that vary and sometimes contradict. We imagine standing in Alexandria's harbor as night falls 2,000 years ago. The lighthouse rises against the darkening sky, its lower sections solid and shadowed, its upper section beginning to glow as workers kindle the evening fire. The flame catches, grows, its light captured by the mirrors and thrown outward toward the sea. Ships approaching from the north see it, that steady point of light, marking safe harbor, marking civilization, marking the end of the dangerous crossing from Rome, or Rhodes, or any of the countless ports that traded with Alexandria. The light burns through the night. The workers tend it, feed it, ensure it does not falter. Out on the dark sea, navigators orient toward it, adjust their courses, feel the relief of knowing where they are, of having guidance in the featureless darkness of open water. The lighthouse performs its function as it has performed it for centuries, as it will perform it for centuries more. The machine that makes darkness navigable, the flame that represents human defiance of night's confusion. But we know the ending. Know the earthquakes are coming. Know the structure will fall. The light will be extinguished. The harbor will lose its beacon. Know that ships will eventually have to navigate without the pharaohs, that sailors will have to find other ways, that the lighthouse will become legend, and then memory, and then scholarly reconstruction from fragmentary sources. The light that guided ships to safety, the flame that burned for 6 centuries, the mirror system that projected light across miles of water, all silenced by time, by earthquake, by the simple mortality of even the most impressive structures. The fortress of Kite Bay stands now where the lighthouse stood. Modern visitors can stand approximately where ancient travelers saw on one of the seven wonders, can look out at the harbor that the lighthouse guarded, can imagine the tower that rose where now only the medieval fortress remains. The light is gone. The machine is silent, but the memory persists. In the word pharaohs, in the accounts of ancient travelers, in the imagination of anyone who contemplates what it must have been like to see that light appear on the horizon, to know that safety was ahead, to be guided home by a flame that had burned for generations, the light that guided ships to safety, the machine that converted fire to beacon, the wonder that fell to earthquakes and was quarried for fortresses, forever dark now, forever silent in the waters where its fragments rest, forever the symbol of human ingenuity meeting human impermanence, of the light we kindle and the darkness that eventually claims it. Before gears and springs and quartz crystals, time was measured by water, drop by drop, flow by flow. The steady movement of liquid through calibrated vessels marked the hours, divided the day, parceled existence into measurable portions. The clepsydra, literally water thief, was the ancient world's most common timekeeping device. A machine so simple in principle and so sophisticated in execution that it remained in use for millennia, remained relevant until mechanical clocks finally supplanted it, remains even now a testament to human ingenuity in measuring what cannot be held. The principle is elementary. Water flows from a higher vessel to a lower vessel at a rate determined by the size of the opening between them. If the opening is constant, if the water pressure is maintained, if the receiving vessel is properly marked, then the rising water level indicates lapsed time. An hour might be marked by a certain amount of water. A watch period might be measured by the time it takes for a vessel to empty. The water does what water does, flows downward, seeks its level, and human cleverness converts this natural behavior into information, into schedule, into the structure that societies need to coordinate their activities. The Egyptians used water clocks as early as 1500 BCE, perhaps earlier. The Babylonians used them. The Greeks refined them. The Romans deployed them throughout their empire. The Chinese developed their own traditions of water timekeeping, as did Persian and Islamic civilizations. The water clock was universal technology, appearing wherever societies grew complex enough to need precise time measurement, wherever coordination required more than the crude divisions of sunrise and sunset. The simplest water clocks were outflow devices. A vessel with a hole near the bottom was filled with water. As the water flowed out, marks on the interior showed how much time had passed. When the vessel emptied, a certain period, an hour, a watch, a portion of the day had elapsed. The device required no moving parts beyond the water itself, required no special materials beyond clay or stone or metal, required only the knowledge to calibrate the marks and the discipline to refill the vessel when it emptied. But simple devices had limitations. The flow rate depended on the water level. As the vessel emptied, the pressure decreased and the water flowed more slowly. The marks on the vessel's interior had to account for this variation, had to be spaced unequally to indicate equal intervals. The calibration was difficult, subject to error, different in summer and winter when temperature affected water's viscosity. Simple water clocks were adequate for rough timekeeping, but inadequate for precision. The Greeks and Romans developed more sophisticated systems. Inflow clocks used a constant level reservoir, a device that maintained steady water pressure regardless of how much water had flowed, feeding a receiving vessel where a float rose steadily, moving a pointer on a calibrated dial. The constant pressure eliminated the variable flow rate, made the timekeeping more accurate, made the reading easier for users who could simply glance at a dial rather than peer inside a vessel. The most sophisticated ancient water clocks incorporated additional mechanisms. Ctesibius of Alexandria, the great engineer of the 3rd century BCE, reportedly built water clocks that combined float systems with gear trains, that automated the display of time, that may have included elaborate visual displays, figures that moved, bells that rang, doors that opened as the hours passed. The accounts are tantalizing but incomplete. We know that such devices existed, know that ancient engineers achieved remarkable sophistication, but we cannot fully reconstruct the mechanisms from the fragmentary descriptions that survive. The Tower of the Winds in Athens preserves evidence of ancient water timekeeping. This octagonal marble tower, built in the 1st century BCE, combined sundials on its exterior faces with a water clock in its interior, an elaborate mechanism that measured time regardless of weather or darkness, that supplemented the solar timekeeping with hydraulic precision. The tower still stands, though its water clock is long gone, its interior empty of the mechanism that once made it function. The architecture survives. The technology has vanished. What did ancient water clocks sound like? The question is worth asking because water clocks were not silent machines. The steady drip of water, the flow through channels, the occasional overflow or adjustment, these sounds would have been the ambient background of timekeeping, the audible evidence that time was being measured, that someone cared enough about hours to build and maintain devices to track them. The water clock announced itself through sound as well as through visual display. The uses were various. Courts used water clocks to limit speakers' time, the allotted period for argument determined by how long it took a vessel to empty. Temples used water clocks for ritual timing, ceremonies that had to begin at specific hours, offerings that had to be made at proper intervals. Military camps used water clocks to regulate watch periods. The guards changed when the water said to change. The discipline of the camp maintained through the discipline of timekeeping. Astronomers used water clocks to time celestial observations. The precise moment when a star crossed the meridian recorded in relation to the water level. But water clocks had limitations that constrained their use. They required water, a substance not always available, not always reliable in freezing temperatures, not always convenient to transport. They required maintenance. The vessels had to be filled. The channels had to be cleared. The mechanisms had to be adjusted as they wore. They required expertise. Someone had to build them correctly, calibrate them accurately, understand their operation well enough to keep them functioning. Water clocks were common, but not universal, were practical, but not portable, were adequate, but not precise by modern standards. The decline of water clocks was gradual. Mechanical clocks, driven by weights and later by springs, began appearing in medieval Europe. The mechanisms were complex, required skilled clockmakers, required metals that could be precisely machined, required understanding of escapement mechanisms that regulated the release of energy, but they offered advantages over water. Mechanical clocks could operate in any temperature, could be made in any size, could be mounted in towers where their dials were visible to entire communities, could eventually be made portable, could become watches, could be carried in pockets, could measure seconds as easily as hours. The water clocks fell silent. The technology that had served for millennia was supplanted, became antiquarian curiosity, became the subject of scholarly reconstruction rather than practical application. The constant drip that had measured ancient hours ceased to flow. The floats that had risen with the passing time sank into disuse. The dials that had displayed the hours were replaced by mechanical faces that clicked rather than flowed. We imagine an ancient water clock in its final operation. The vessel has been filled for the last time. The water flows through channels worn smooth by decades of use. The float rises in its chamber, moving the pointer across the dial. The hours pass as they have passed for years, for decades, for perhaps centuries, but no one will fill the vessel again. No one will read the dial tomorrow. The clock measures its final day, performs its function one last time, and then falls silent. Perhaps the end was sudden, conquest or fire or earthquake destroying the mechanism in a moment. Perhaps the end was gradual, neglect and disrepair, water no longer flowing, maintenance no longer performed. Perhaps the mechanism was deliberately dismantled, its parts repurposed, its function taken over by newer technology. However it ended, the water clock that had measured countless hours measured its last hour and then was still. The water that measured time, the clepsydra that stole hours from the formless flow of existence, the drip and flow and rise that made schedule possible, that coordinated societies, that divided the day into portions that could be allotted and accounted, forever silent now, forever dry in the fragments that survive, forever testimony to the human need to measure what cannot be held, to track what perpetually passes, to create machines that model the invisible passage that we call time. In the temples of ancient Alexandria, worshippers witnessed wonders. Doors swung open without visible cause when the altar fire was lit. Statues poured libations as if animated by divine power. Trumpets sounded from hidden sources. The gods seemed present, seemed active, seemed to respond to the rituals performed in their honor. The worshippers marveled. They believed. They did not know, or perhaps preferred not to know, that the wonders were engineered, that machines hidden in temple walls and beneath temple floors produced the effects that seemed miraculous. Heron of Alexandria documented these devices, writing in the 1st century CE. This engineer and mathematician described dozens of automata, self-moving devices powered by water, steam, weights, compressed air, and other sources that ancient technology could harness. His treatises read like manuals for creating wonder, like instructions for building machines that would amaze and deceive, would make the divine seem present through technological trickery. The temple doors that opened by fire, the wine that flowed from empty vessels, the statues that moved and poured and gestured, all explained, all reduced to mechanism, all revealed as human ingenuity masquerading as supernatural intervention. The fire opening door was elegantly simple in concept. When the altar fire was lit, it heated air in a sealed chamber beneath the altar. The expanding air pushed on water in a connected vessel, forcing the water through pipes into a bucket. As the bucket filled and grew heavy, it descended, pulling on ropes that ran through pulleys to the temple doors, which swung open. When the fire was extinguished and the air cooled, the pressure dropped, the water flowed back, the bucket rose, and the door swung closed. The mechanism required no supernatural intervention, only understanding of thermal expansion, hydraulics, and mechanical advantage. Heron described this device not as sacred mystery, but as technical problem, as application of principles to achieve desired effect. His treatises suggest he saw no contradiction between religious use and mechanical explanation. The device could serve in temples, could produce wonder, could support worship, even though its operation was entirely natural. Perhaps worshippers knew. Perhaps priests knew and worshippers preferred not to ask. Perhaps the wonder was not diminished by understanding, was enhanced by the skill that created it, was tribute to human capability as much as to divine presence. The other devices were equally ingenious. A vessel that dispensed holy water when a coin was inserted. The coin's weight pressed a lever that opened a valve, releasing a measured amount of water before the lever returned to its original position. The first vending machine, essentially deployed in temple contexts where worshippers could receive their portion of sacred water through mechanical mediation. The device required no priest to dispense the water, operated automatically as long as it was maintained, reduced sacred transaction to mechanism. The wine pouring statue used similar principles. A sealed vessel of wine was connected to a figure by hidden tubes. When the vessel was heated, perhaps by sunlight, perhaps by fire beneath, the expanding air forced wine through the tubes and out of the statue's hand or mouth, creating the appearance of miraculous dispensation. Cool the vessel, and the flow stopped. The statue seemed to pour at will, to choose when to offer its liquid gift, to exercise discretion that was actually thermal response. The singing birds of Heron's design, perched on branches above a fountain. As water flowed, it compressed air in chambers below, forcing the air through pipes, calibrated to produce whistling sounds that resembled birdsong. The water rose and fell. The air was compressed and released. The pipes sounded in sequence, and the artificial birds seemed to sing, seemed to animate the garden or temple where the fountain stood. The device created illusion of life from the physics of fluid and compressed air. What did it mean that such devices existed? The question has several dimensions. On one hand, the automata demonstrate ancient mechanical sophistication, understanding of pneumatics, hydraulics, and mechanics that enabled the creation of complex devices that represents knowledge sometimes assumed to be medieval or modern in origin. Heron and his predecessors and successors knew more than we often credit, achieved more than we often imagine, built machines that would not be surpassed in some respects until the industrial era. On another hand, the automata raise questions about ancient religion. If temple wonders were mechanically produced, what did priests know, and when did they know it? Were the worshippers deceived, or were they complicit in a performance whose mechanics they understood, but whose meaning they nonetheless valued? Did the mechanical explanation diminish the religious experience, or did it simply provide one framework among several for understanding events that remained meaningful regardless of their cause. The relationship between technology and belief, between mechanism and miracle, is complex in any era. The ancient automata embody that complexity. The devices also raise questions about knowledge transmission. Heron's treatises survived, but how many similar treatises did not? How many engineers created comparable devices without documenting their methods? The automata that Heron describes may represent a broader tradition of mechanical innovation that left few written records, that was passed from master to apprentice through practice rather than through text, that existed in workshops and temples without being preserved in libraries. Heron's survival may be accident rather than representative, may give us glimpse of tradition far larger than the surviving documents indicate. The automata fell silent. The temples where they operated were closed by Christian emperors who suppressed pagan worship, by changing populations who abandoned old cults, by the simple passage of centuries that transformed vibrant religious centers into ruins. The mechanisms were dismantled or simply ceased to be maintained. The doors no longer opened when fires were lit. The statues no longer poured. The birds no longer sang. The wonder that had amazed worshippers became wonder that amazed scholars who read Heron's descriptions and could barely believe what they described. Reconstructions have been attempted. Modern engineers have built working versions of Heron's devices, have demonstrated that they function as described, have proved that ancient technology was capable of what the texts claim. The reconstructions work. The doors open when fire is lit. The wine pours when vessels are heated. The principles are sound. The mechanisms are practical. The achievement is real. But the reconstructions are demonstrations. Our museum pieces are not operating in temples where worshippers await the wonder. The context has vanished, even when the mechanism can be restored. We imagine standing in an ancient temple as the priest lights the altar fire. The flames rise, the heat builds. We wait, watching the doors, knowing what will happen though the mechanism is hidden. And slowly, slowly enough to seem deliberate, slowly enough to seem willed, the doors begin to swing. The temple's inner sanctuary is revealed. The god's image becomes visible. The ritual can proceed, enabled by technology, experienced as wonder, meaningful regardless of the explanation that exists beneath the altar, in the pipes and chambers that make the miracle possible, the doors that opened by fire, the statues that poured without human touch, the birds that sang through water and air, the automata that amazed ancient worshippers and now amaze modern scholars, forever silent now, forever still in the temples that no longer exist, in the mechanisms that were never rebuilt, in the traditions that ended when the last engineer died without transmitting in his knowledge, the ancient machines that created wonder, the wonder that the silence has not entirely erased. In the Baghdad Museum, before the looting of 2003, there sat a clay jar, unassuming in appearance, perhaps 5 inches tall, unremarkable in shape. The jar contained something that should not have been there: a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and traces of an acidic substance. The combination suggested something impossible. The combination suggested a battery. The combination suggested that ancient peoples had discovered electrical generation 2 millennia before Volta, had built devices that produced current from chemical reaction, had harnessed lightning, or at least its humble cousin, galvanic electricity, for purposes we can only guess. The Baghdad Battery, as it came to be called, was found in Kujut Rabu, near Baghdad, dating to the Parthian period, roughly 250 BC to 224 CE. The discovery was made in 936, and speculation about its purpose has continued ever since. Was it really a battery? Did ancient Mesopotamians truly understand electrochemistry? What would they have used electrical current for? The questions multiply, and definitive answers remain elusive. The case for battery function is simple enough to state: a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod, separated by an electrolyte, the acidic substance, would generate voltage through galvanic action. The same principle powers modern batteries, powers countless devices that our civilization depends upon. If the Baghdad artifacts were assembled and filled with acidic liquid, grape juice, vinegar, lemon juice, they would produce current. Experiments have demonstrated this. The device works, but working is not the same as intended. Skeptics point out that many explanations exist for the artifacts that do not require battery function. The jars might have stored scrolls, with the copper cylinder protecting the documents from decay. They might have been part of some other apparatus whose purpose we cannot reconstruct. The acidic residue might be accidental, might be post-depositional, might have nothing to do with original function. The battery interpretation is possible, but so are other interpretations, and we cannot determine which is correct from the artifacts alone. If they were batteries, what were they for? This question is crucial and largely unanswered. The current produced by such devices would be weak, sufficient for certain purposes, but not for others. The most common theory suggests electroplating, using electrical current to deposit thin layers of metal onto objects, to silver or gold plate cheaper materials, to create decorative effects through technology rather than through solid, precious metal. Evidence for ancient electroplating exists, though it is disputed. Some artifacts show metal coatings that might have been deposited electrically, might show the characteristic patterns of electroplating rather than of fire gilding or mechanical application, but the evidence is not conclusive. Other methods of applying metal coatings exist and were widely used. The electroplating hypothesis remains plausible but unproven. Other theories are more speculative. Ritual use, perhaps. The tingle of mild electric current interpreted as divine touch, as evidence of supernatural presence, as confirmation of priestly power. Medical use, perhaps. electrical stimulation applied to treat pain or illness, as would be done in later centuries with much more powerful devices. Experimental investigation, perhaps. Curious minds exploring natural phenomena without necessarily developing practical applications. Each theory is possible, none is confirmed. The artifacts themselves add complexity. Not one battery was found, but multiple, suggesting systematic production rather than accidental combination, suggesting that whatever purpose the devices served was important enough to warrant repeated construction. The copper cylinders were carefully made, were standardized in dimension, were not casual improvisations, but deliberate manufactures. Someone knew what they were doing, someone did it repeatedly, someone had reason to create these devices again and again. But knowledge does not always persist. Even if ancient Mesopotamians discovered galvanic electricity, even if they used it for electroplating or other purposes, the knowledge did not transmit to later generations, did not spread to other civilizations, did not become part of the technological toolkit that humanity carried forward through centuries. The battery, if that is what it was invention that did not proliferate, was achievement that did not accumulate, was knowledge that was gained and then lost. The loss raises questions that extend beyond this single case. How many discoveries have been made and then forgotten? How many technologies have been invented and then lost? We tend to assume that technological progress is cumulative, that knowledge once gained is preserved and built upon. The Baghdad battery, if genuine, challenges that assumption, suggests that discovery and preservation are separate processes, that invention without transmission is equivalent to no invention at all, that the chain from discovery to lasting impact requires more than just the initial insight. The vessels that may have held lightning, the jars that may have generated current, the batteries that may have existed 2,000 years before Volta, we cannot be certain they were what they appear to be, cannot be certain the electrical function was intended, cannot be certain that ancient Mesopotamians understood what they had created or used it for purposes that required understanding. The artifacts sit in ambiguity, suggesting possibilities without confirming them, raising questions without answering them. The silence of the Baghdad battery is the silence of uncertainty, not the silence of a mechanism that definitely worked and definitely stopped, but the silence of a mechanism that may never have worked, may never have been intended to work, may be something entirely other than what it appears to modern eyes accustomed to seeing batteries in such configurations. The silence is epistemic as well as mechanical. We do not know what sounds this device made, if any, because we do not know what this device did, if anything. We hold the imagination of it. A clay jar in ancient Mesopotamia, assembled with copper and iron, filled with acidic liquid, producing a faint current that tingles against the skin, that deposits metal atom by atom onto objects placed in solution, that does something, something we cannot verify, something we can only hypothesize, the vessel that may have held lightning, the machine that may have run in darkness for purposes we cannot recover, the ancient discovery that may have been made and may have been lost, leaving only ambiguous artifacts and endless speculation, the Baghdad battery, the mystery that cannot be resolved, the silence that is uncertainty rather than cessation, forever asking what the ancients knew, forever refusing to answer with certainty, forever embodying the gap between artifact and interpretation, between what survives and what it meant, between the objects in museum cases and the purposes they served in hands now dust. Beneath the cities of ancient Rome, beneath the villas and forums and temples, water flowed through channels built to last millennia, built with precision that modern engineers admire, built to supply a population of 1 million people with the water they needed for drinking, bathing, cleaning, manufacturing, display. The aqueducts of Rome, those monumental, arched structures that still stride across the Italian countryside, were only the visible portion of a system that extended for hundreds of miles, that represented one of antiquity's greatest engineering achievements, that made possible the urban density that Rome's population required. The city's first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, was built in 312 BCE, the same year that saw the beginning of the Via Appia, Rome's first great road. The engineer was Appius Claudius Caecus, whose ambitious projects transformed Rome from a regional power to something grander, something that required infrastructure on a scale no Italian city had previously attempted. The Aqua Appia ran mostly underground, protecting its water from contamination and from enemies who might seek to cut the city's supply. Later, aqueducts would be more visible, would stride across valleys on arched bridges that became symbols of Roman engineering might. By the height of the empire, Rome was served by 11 major aqueducts, carrying an estimated 300 million gallons of water daily into the city. The quantity is staggering. More water per capita than most modern cities provide. More water than the city could reasonably use if water were charged by volume. But water was free in Rome, was public good provided through imperial munificence, flowed continuously through fountains that never stopped, that created the sound of running water throughout the city, that made water available to rich and poor alike. The engineering was sophisticated beyond the visible arches. The aqueducts maintained precise gradients, slight slopes that used gravity to move water from distant sources to urban destinations. The slopes were calculated to move water quickly enough to discourage stagnation, but slowly enough to prevent erosion of the channel's lining. The precision required surveying techniques that we still do not fully understand, instruments that have not survived, knowledge that was transmitted through apprenticeship rather than through texts. The channels were lined with waterproof cement opus sinonum, made with crucite pottery fragments that gave the cement its hydraulic properties. The lining prevented water loss through seepage, protected the water from contamination by surrounding soil, created smooth surfaces that reduced friction and turbulence. The Romans understood hydraulics in ways that we can observe in their construction even when we lack their written explanations. The distribution within the city was equally sophisticated. Water from the aqueducts flowed into castella, distribution tanks that divided the supply among different uses and different neighborhoods. From the castella, lead pipes carried water to public fountains, to public baths, to wealthy private homes that paid for the privilege of direct connection. The system was hierarchical. If supply dropped, the first cuts went to private users, then to baths, with public fountains maintained as long as possible. The priorities reflected Roman values. Public access to water was more important than private convenience. The baths consumed enormous quantities. The baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, the countless smaller baths throughout the city all required constant water supply for their pools and fountains, their heating systems and drainage. The baths were not merely hygienic facilities, but were social centers, places where Romans gathered to exercise and converse and conduct business. The water that filled them was the water that made Roman urban culture possible, that enabled the cleanliness and the social rituals that defined Roman civilization. But the system required maintenance. The channels had to be inspected, cleared of debris, repaired when damaged. The distribution infrastructure had to be monitored, adjusted, maintained against the constant pressure of water flowing through pipes and joints. The technical staff required inspectors, engineers, laborers, numbered in the hundreds, formed a bureaucracy dedicated to keeping the water flowing, to maintaining the infrastructure that the city depended upon. When the empire weakened, the maintenance faltered. When the barbarians invaded, the aqueducts became targets. Cutting the water supply was effective siege warfare, could bring a city to its knees faster than direct assault. The aqueducts were cut, were damaged, were neglected as the population that depended on them shrank, as the resources that maintained them disappeared, as the knowledge that built them was lost or dispersed. The water stopped flowing. The silence that fell over Rome's water system was gradual. One aqueduct failed while others continued. Then another. The supply diminished. The fountains that had flowed continuously began to fail. The baths that had served thousands closed as water became scarce. The population, already shrinking from other causes, concentrated near the remaining water sources, near the Tiber River, near the few aqueducts that still functioned, near springs within the city walls. By the medieval period, Rome was a shadow of its former size. The population that had exceeded 1 million had fallen to perhaps 30,000. The aqueducts that had carried hundreds of millions of gallons daily were ruins, their arches collapsing, their channels dry, their engineering marvels becoming picturesque remnants that travelers admired without fully understanding. The water that had sustained the empire's capital no longer flowed. The restoration came slowly over centuries. Renaissance popes rebuilt some aqueducts, restored some fountains, returned some water to a city that had lived without it for a millennium. The Trevi Fountain, that Baroque masterpiece where tourists throw coins, is terminus of the Aqua Virgo, an aqueduct originally built in 19 BCE, restored in 1453, reaching its current form in 1762. The water that flows there has flowed with the interruptions for 2,000 years. The channels that carried life, the aqueducts that made Rome possible, the engineering that supplied 1 million people with water they took for granted. The system ran for centuries, ran in darkness, beneath streets where people walked without knowing what flowed below, ran until it didn't, until the maintenance stopped, until the invaders cut the channels, until the knowledge to repair them was lost. The silence lasted 1,000 years. The water that had never stopped suddenly stopped and did not return for generations. We walk now along the ruins of the Aqua Claudia, that aqueduct whose arches stride across the Roman countryside, impressive even in decay. The channels are dry. The water that once flowed here, cold and clean from springs in the hills, has not flowed for 15 centuries. The engineering remains, testimony to what was achieved. The function has ceased, testimony to what was lost. The channels that carried life, forever dry now in most of their length, forever testimony to infrastructure that sustained a civilization and then fell silent when that civilization could no longer sustain it. The water that made Rome possible, the silence that marked Rome's fall. Beneath the deserts of Iran, beneath the arid landscapes where rainfall measures in inches per year, water flows through tunnels hand dug over millennia, tunnels that tap into underground aquifers, tunnels that carry water from mountains to plains through systems so ingenious that they still function today. After 2,000 years, after 3,000 years, after longer than any written records can confirm. The Qanats of Persia, the underground rivers that made civilization possible in lands where surface water could not survive. The principle is simple. Water collects in mountain aquifers, underground layers of permeable rock that absorb rainfall and snowmelt, that store water that surface rivers would quickly lose to evaporation. A tunnel dug into the aquifer can tap this water, can allow it to flow by gravity through a gently sloping channel, can deliver it to settlements miles away without losing it to the sun. The water flows entirely underground until it reaches its destination, protected from evaporation, requiring no pumping, operating on nothing but gravity and the careful engineering of generations of diggers. The construction was dangerous. The Mukani, the Qanat builders, dug vertical shafts first, spaced every 50 meters or so along the planned tunnel route. The shafts served multiple purposes. They provided access to the tunnel during construction, and afterward, they allowed debris to be removed. They permitted air circulation that made working in the tunnel bearable. The shafts also marked the route. From the air, a canot appears as a line of circular depressions stretching across the landscape, evidence of the tunnel below. From the bottom of each shaft, the Mukani dug horizontally, connecting one shaft to the next, creating the continuous channel through which water would flow. The work was done in cramped darkness, by lamplight, with simple tools, picks and shovels, baskets for removing debris, wooden hoists for lifting the debris up the shafts. The danger was constant. Cave-ins killed workers. Flooding killed workers. Bad air in poorly ventilated sections killed workers. The qanats that survive today were built with blood as well as sweat, with lives as well as labor. The length of some qanats is extraordinary. The qanat of Gonabad in eastern Iran stretches for over 45 kilometers, reaches depths of more than 300 meters at its mother well, the deepest point, where the tunnel first taps the aquifer. The construction took generations. The maintenance has continued for millennia. The water still flows, still supplies the city of Gonabad, still performs the function its builders intended. More than 2,500 years ago, the qanats made Persian civilization possible in ways that surface water could not. The Iranian plateau is semi-arid at best, desert in many regions, incapable of supporting large populations through rainfall agriculture alone. But the aquifers beneath the mountains contain water that fell as rain or snow generations ago. Water that accumulated over centuries. Water that the qanats could access and deliver. The cities of ancient Persia, Persepolis, Isfahan, Yazd, were sustained by qanat water, were made possible by the underground rivers that their builders engineered. The technology spread. Qanats appear across the Middle East, across North Africa, across Central Asia, wherever Persian influence reached, wherever the technology was appropriate to local conditions, wherever communities faced the challenge of water, scarce on the surface but available underground. The Spanish brought qanat technology to the Americas, where similar systems were built in Mexico and Peru. The technology was adaptable, was transferable, was knowledge that could be learned and applied in new contexts. But the technology also required maintenance. The tunnel silted up over time, needed to be cleared. The shafts collapsed, needed to be repaired or replaced. The water table dropped in some areas, required extending the tunnel deeper into the aquifer. Each qanat was a commitment, not just to construction, but to perpetual maintenance, to the ongoing investment of labor and resources that the system required. Communities that built qanats were binding themselves to infrastructure that would demand attention for generations, for centuries, for as long as the community survived. Some qanats have been abandoned. The towns they served have been depopulated by war or economic change. The labor to maintain them has become unavailable or unaffordable. The water table has dropped below the level the tunnel can reach. The underground rivers that once sustained settlements now flow unused, their water emptying into sinks where no one collects it, their tunnels gradually collapsing without the maintenance that kept them open. The abandoned qanats are the silent ones, the systems that ran for centuries and now run to no purpose, that carry water no one uses, that represent infrastructure outliving the communities it was built to serve. The shafts that mark their routes are visible from the air, lines of depressions crossing the desert, evidence of investment and ingenuity that time has rendered obsolete. But many qanats still function, still carry water to cities and farms, still perform the purpose their builders intended, still represent continuous operation across millennia. The qanat of Zarq in Yazd has supplied water for more than 3,000 years. The system has been maintained, has been repaired, has been adapted to changing conditions, has been passed from generation to generation as living technology rather than as archaeological remnant. We descend a shaft in imagination, climbing down the steps or ladder that qanat builders installed, feeling the temperature drop as we descend from desert heat toward underground cool. At the bottom, the tunnel stretches in both directions, upstream toward the aquifer, downstream toward the settlement. The water flows past our feet, cold and clear, moving steadily through the channel the Mukani dug by lamplight in the cramped darkness. The sound of flowing water fills the tunnel, fills the silence that otherwise would be complete. This water fell as rain in the mountains years ago, decades ago, perhaps centuries ago. It seeped into the aquifer, was stored in the porous rock, waited until the qanat tunnel reached it, and released it to flow toward settlements it would never see. The water is ancient, is patient, is testimony to the slow cycles of hydrology that the qanat system harvests, that makes desert cities possible through human intervention in natural processes. The underground rivers of Persia, the qanats that tap aquifers and deliver water to parched lands, the technology that has functioned for millennia, that still functions where communities maintain it, that falls silent where maintenance ceases, the tunnels that were dug with blood and sweat, that represent commitment across generations, that bind communities to infrastructure as long as they wish to survive. The water flows still in thousands of qanats across Iran and beyond. The technology that made Persian civilization possible continues making life possible in regions where surface water cannot survive. The underground rivers that human hands created still carry their cargo, still connect mountain aquifers to desert settlements, still perform the function that ancient engineers designed. But some have fallen silent, some run to no purpose, some testify to communities that no longer exist, to investments that no longer pay returns, to infrastructure that has outlived its users. The silence of the abandoned qanat is the silence of entropy, of maintenance withdrawn, of systems designed for permanence, meeting the impermanence of human institutions. The underground rivers of Persia, forever flowing where maintained, forever silent where abandoned, forever testimony to human ingenuity and human transience, to the infrastructure that outlasts and the infrastructure that outlives, to the water that flows in darkness and the darkness that eventually claims what the water once sustained. In Kaifeng, the capital of Song Dynasty China, a tower rose above the city. It was not the tallest structure in the city, not the most beautiful, not the most sacred, but it was perhaps the most ingenious. A tower that contained a mechanism driven by water that told the time not merely to those who could see its face, but to the entire city through automatic signals that represented the synthesis of astronomical observation, mechanical engineering, and governmental organization that characterized Chinese civilization at its height. Susong's astronomical clock tower, completed in 1094 CE, was the most sophisticated timekeeping device built anywhere in the world up to that point. It combined water-driven mechanism with astronomical modeling, automatic display with accurate measurement, practical timekeeping with celestial observation. The tower was machine in the fullest sense, a device that converted water's potential energy into measured motion, into the turning of armillary sphere and celestial globe, into the striking of bells and the appearance of figures that announced the hours. The mechanism was powered by a steady flow of water that drove a wheel through a system Su Song called the celestial balance, an escapement mechanism that released the wheel to turn by measured increments, that converted continuous flow into discrete steps, that gave the machine the regular rhythm necessary for accurate timekeeping. The principle was similar to the escapements that would later appear in European mechanical clocks, but Su Song achieved it centuries earlier, achieved it with water rather than with weights, achieved it in a mechanism far larger and more complex than anything Europe would build for hundreds of years. The tower's functions were multiple. The armillary sphere at the top automatically tracked celestial positions, rotating to follow the heavens, providing astronomers with a mechanical model of celestial motion. The celestial globe displayed the stars, visible at any time, rotating in synchrony with the sky it modeled. These astronomical functions served the state's need for accurate calendars, for astrological observation, for the celestial monitoring that Chinese imperial ideology considered essential to good governance. But the tower also served ordinary timekeeping. Wooden figures emerged from doors at appropriate intervals, announcing the hours through visual display. Bells and drums sounded automatically, marking time audibly for those who could not see the figures. The tower broadcast the time to the city, made the hours public knowledge, standardized temporal awareness in ways that previous technologies could not achieve. The sophistication was remarkable. Su Song's treatise documenting the clock tower runs to hundreds of pages, includes detailed technical drawings, explains the principles underlying each component. The documentation is so complete that modern reconstructions have been built, that the mechanism can be verified, that we know it worked because we can make it work again. The tower was not legend, but engineering, not myth, but mechanism, its operation confirmed through the precision of its documentation. But the tower did not last. The Jurchen invasion of 1127 captured Kaifeng, ended the Northern Song dynasty, scattered the court that had supported Su Song's creation. The tower was dismantled and moved north, but reassembly proved impossible. The craftsmen who could operate and maintain the mechanism were dispersed or dead. The knowledge needed to keep it running was lost in the chaos of conquest. Within a generation, the most sophisticated clock in the world was silent. The silence has lasted 9 centuries. The tower was never rebuilt, never replicated, never restored to function. The treatise survived, preserved in libraries, studied by scholars. But the mechanism itself was gone, was memory, was description without instantiation. The tower that had told all of Kaifeng the hour stopped telling anything to anyone, became text rather than technology, became knowledge preserved in writing rather than knowledge preserved in operation. Why was it not rebuilt? The question illuminates the fragility of complex technology. The clock tower required specialized craftsmen, metalworkers, astronomers, hydraulic engineers, woodworkers, whose skills had to be coordinated, whose knowledge had to be integrated, whose collaboration made the mechanism possible. It required resources, the metals and wood, the water supply, the sustained labor of construction. It required institutional support, the state apparatus that funded construction, that maintained operation, that valued the tower enough to invest in its perpetuation. The conquest disrupted all of these. The craftsmen died or dispersed. The resources were diverted to other purposes. The institutional support vanished with the dynasty that had provided it. The tower was not rebuilt because the conditions for building it no longer existed, because the network of skills and resources and support that had created it had dissolved, because complex technology depends on complex society, and complex society is fragile. Later Chinese dynasties built clocks, but none matched Su Song's tower. The technology regressed, simplified, lost the sophistication that the Song achievement had represented. The knowledge preserved in Su Song's treatise was theoretical, could inform future builders, but could not itself build anything. The gap between documented knowledge and operational capacity proved unbridgeable for centuries. European contact eventually brought new clock technology to China. The mechanical clocks that Jesuits presented to Chinese emperors in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Chinese found these devices fascinating, collected them, studied them, eventually learned to build them. But by then, the memory of Su Song's tower was antiquarian, was scholarly interest rather than practical precedent, was evidence of what had been achieved rather than foundation for what would be built. We imagine the tower in operation. The water flows steadily through channels calibrated to maintain constant pressure. The celestial balance releases the wheel by measured increments, tick, 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 the rhythm of mechanical time. The armillary sphere rotates, following the heavens it models. The figures emerge from doors, announcing the hours. The bells sound, their notes carrying across the city, telling Kaifeng that the hour has changed, that time continues its measured progress, that the state's apparatus includes even the measurement of temporal flow. The tower told all of China the hour. For a generation, perhaps two, the mechanism ran, the time was broadcast. The sophistication amazed visitors who had never seen such a device. And then it stopped. The invasion came, the capital fell, the tower was dismantled, the silence began. The most sophisticated clock in the world became the most sophisticated clock that no longer existed, that was known only through texts, that testified to achievement that could not be sustained. The tower that told all of China the hour, the mechanism that synthesized astronomy and engineering, timekeeping and statecraft, the achievement that lasted barely a generation before war silenced it, forever described in Su Song's treatise, forever silent in the centuries since the invasion, forever testimony to what can be achieved and how quickly it can be lost. They stood in gardens and palace halls, in temples and workshops, in the courts of kings and caliphs who collected wonders, figures that moved without visible cause, that poured wine and played music, that seemed to possess the animation of life within their metal and stone bodies, the automata of the ancient and medieval world, the machines that seemed to live. The tradition stretches back millennia. The Greeks told stories of Hephaestus, divine craftsman who built golden maidens that served him, who created Talos, the bronze giant that guarded Crete. Whether these stories reflect actual mechanical achievements or merely the imagination of what technology might achieve is unclear. The line between myth and engineering blurs when the engineering is lost and only stories remain. But the stories testify to ancient fascination with artificial life, with the possibility that human craft might create motion and seeming intelligence, might replicate in metal what nature achieves in flesh. The historical automata are better documented. Heron of Alexandria described figures that moved through pneumatic and hydraulic power, birds that sang, figures that poured, mechanisms that created the illusion of autonomous action. Heron's treatises read like manuals for wonder, like instructions for building devices that would amaze audiences who could not see the hidden pipes and chambers, the weights and counterweights, the engineering that produced the apparent magic. The Islamic world developed its own tradition. Al-Jazari, the 12th century engineer, wrote a book of ingenious devices that included elaborate automata, a mechanical boat with musicians that actually played instruments, a hand washing device where a figure poured water when needed, clocks whose passage of time was marked by moving figures and mechanical animals. The sophistication is remarkable. The mechanisms are documented in enough detail that modern reconstructions are possible, that we can verify the devices worked as described. The automata served various purposes. Entertainment, certainly. The kings and caliphs who commissioned these devices enjoyed displaying them, enjoyed the amazement of guests who witnessed mechanical figures performing actions that seemed impossible, but also demonstration of power. The ruler who could command such technology commanded resources and knowledge that others lacked, displayed capability that reinforced political authority. The automata were propaganda in metal, statements about the sophistication of courts that possess them. Some automata served practical purposes. Al-Jazari's hand-washing device was functional. It actually dispensed water when needed, actually assisted in the ritual ablutions that Islamic practice required. The mechanical clocks that marked time with moving figures provided actual timekeeping alongside the wonder they created. The automata were not merely toys, but were devices that combined function with spectacle, that served while they amazed. The medieval European courts developed their own tradition, influenced by Islamic examples that crusaders encountered and that trade brought westward. Mechanical figures appeared in church clocks. The astronomical clocks of Strasbourg and Prague, with their processions of apostles and cosmic displays, their moving figures that marked hours with motion as well as sound. These devices served religious purposes, reminded viewers of sacred time, of the cosmic order that the church mediated, of the divine craftsmanship that human craft could only dimly imitate. But the automata also raised theological questions. If human hands could create figures that moved, that seemed to act autonomously, what did this say about the nature of life, about the nature of the soul, about the difference between the living and the merely mechanical? The questions were not merely theoretical. They touched on issues of creation and creator, on the boundaries between divine prerogative and human capability, on what it meant that matter could be arranged into motion without the breath of life. The most famous automata of the pre-modern world are mostly lost. The Islamic devices that Al-Jazari described survive only in manuscript and reconstruction. The Byzantine throne room, with its golden tree full of singing birds, its lions that roared and rose on their hind legs, described by amazed ambassadors who witnessed its wonders, is known only from accounts that may exaggerate, that certainly cannot be verified. The devices that amazed medieval courts are gone, their mechanisms dismantled or decayed, their wonder preserved only in the texts that described them. Some later automata survive. The 18th century saw a flourishing of mechanical figures, Wilkinson's digesting duck that seemed to eat and excrete, Jacques Droz's writing boy that actually wrote messages, the countless mechanical musicians and dancers that delighted European courts. These devices, some of which survive and function, testify to the traditions continuation, to the persistent fascination with artificial life that drove craftsmen to create ever more sophisticated mechanisms. But the ancient and medieval automata are silent. The birds no longer sing. The figures no longer pour. The lions of the Byzantine throne room no longer roar. The mechanisms that amazed courts across centuries have fallen still, have been lost or dismantled, have become descriptions in texts rather than wonders in operation. What happened to them? Some were destroyed in the catastrophes that destroyed their settings, invasions and fires, and the simple decay that claims everything inadequately maintained. Some were dismantled for their valuable materials. The gold and silver that made them precious also made them targets for recycling when their wonder had faded. Some simply wore out. The mechanisms that created motion eventually wore beyond repair, became artifacts rather than automata, silent remnants of former function. The silence of the automata is the silence of wonder ceased. The figures that seemed to live are now dead in ways that bronze and gold cannot really die. Not destroyed, but stilled. Not ended, but stopped. Their motion arrested indefinitely. Their seeming life revealed as the mechanism it always was. The wonder they created depended on motion, on the appearance of autonomy, on the illusion that something was happening that transcended ordinary causation. Without motion, the wonder evaporates. The automaton becomes mere statue, merely arranged matter, no longer seeming to live. We imagine a medieval court, the caliph's throne room perhaps, where guests are brought to witness the wonders. The mechanical tree stands in the corner, its branches golden, its leaves glittering with gems. As the guests watch, the birds in the branches begin to move, to turn their heads, to open their beaks, to sing songs that emerge from mechanisms hidden in their bodies. The guests gasp. The caliph smiles. The automata perform their function, creating wonder that reinforces the court's prestige. The figures that seemed to live, the mechanisms that created the illusion of autonomous action, the tradition that stretched from antiquity through the medieval period and into modernity, forever fascinating humans who wonder whether craft can create life, whether mechanism can replicate consciousness, whether the difference between living and mechanical is as clear as we assume. The ancient automata are silent now. The birds do not sing. The figures do not pour. The lions do not roar. The wonder is preserved in texts that describe it, but cannot recreate it, that tell us what was achieved without allowing us to experience the achievement. The figures that seemed to live, forever still now, forever testimony to human fascination with artificial life, and to the silence that eventually claims all motion, all mechanism, all seeming life that is not truly alive. Before the machines that measured time, before the machines that created wonder, there were simpler machines, machines that transformed raw material into useful form, that took ore from the earth and made it metal, that converted the potential of stone and charcoal into the actuality of bronze and iron. The furnaces that forged empires, the machines whose running made civilization possible. The earliest metallurgy required only fire and knowledge, the understanding that certain rocks, when heated sufficiently, would yield metal. Copper emerged first, soft and malleable, useful for ornaments and simple tools. The discovery was made independently in multiple places, wherever copper ore existed, wherever people experimented with fire and stone, wherever the accidental revelation of metal within rock led to deliberate replication. But copper alone was insufficient, too soft for serious tools, too weak for weapons that could compete with stone. The breakthrough came with alloys. The discovery that adding tin to copper produced bronze, a metal harder and more durable, suitable for weapons and tools that transformed societies. The Bronze Age began when furnaces learned to produce this alloy, when the technology of mixing metals created material that could be cast into axes and swords, into vessels and ornaments, into the artifacts that define the period. The furnaces were machines in the essential sense. They converted energy, the chemical energy of burning charcoal, into useful work, the transformation of ore into metal. They required design, the shape and ventilation that determined how hot the fire could get, how efficiently the ore could be reduced, how pure the resulting metal would be. They required operation, the maintenance of temperature, the addition of fuel, the timing of processing. That experience refined over generations. The furnaces were not merely pits of fire, but were engineered systems, machines for metallurgical transformation. The sound of the Bronze Age was the sound of furnaces running, the roar of flames fed by bellows, forcing air into fires that could reach the temperatures needed to smelt ore and melt metal. The hiss of bronze poured into molds, the steam and smoke of casting, the ring of hammers on cooling metal, shaping what the furnace had produced. The sound was industrial, was the noise of transformation, was the acoustic signature of technology changing what humans could do. The Iron Age required hotter fires. Iron ore smelts at higher temperatures than copper, requires more sophisticated furnaces, demands greater mastery of combustion. The bloomery furnaces that first produced iron were advances over bronze furnaces, taller, better ventilated, capable of reaching the temperatures needed to reduce iron ore to workable metal. The iron that emerged was not liquid like bronze, but was spongy mass, bloom, that required hammering to consolidate, to drive out impurities, to produce the wrought iron that could be worked into tools and weapons. The blast furnace arrived later, in China by the 5th century BCE, in Europe not until the medieval period. The blast furnace used water power to drive bellows continuously, maintaining temperatures high enough to produce liquid iron, to cast iron directly rather than working it from blooms. The technology transformed iron production, made it far more efficient, made iron abundant in ways it had never been. The blast furnace running was the sound of industrial revolution beginning, of metallurgy achieving scale that would eventually transform the world. But the furnaces required fuel. The Bronze Age consumed forests. The charcoal that fired the furnaces came from trees, and the trees did not regenerate as fast as the furnaces consumed them. Regions that developed advanced metallurgy often depleted their timber, faced fuel shortages that constrained production, had to import charcoal from forested regions, or had to limit their metalwork. The furnaces that forged empires also consumed the landscapes that fed them. The furnaces of antiquity are mostly silent now. The Bronze Age foundries are archaeological sites, their fire pits cold for millennia, their products found in graves and hoards, but not in living operation. The bloomeries that produced early iron are reconstructed by experimental archaeologists who wonder whether their replicas truly capture what ancient smiths achieved. The continuity of the tradition has broken. The knowledge that operated ancient furnaces is not the knowledge that operates modern foundries, though modern understanding can partially reconstruct what was once done. Some traditional metallurgy persists. In remote regions, in deliberate preservations, furnaces still operate as they have operated for centuries. The Japanese Tatara furnace still produces the steel for traditional swords using techniques refined over generations, maintaining skills that industrialization elsewhere has displaced. These survivors are connections to the past, demonstrations that the ancient methods still work, evidence that the silence has not been complete. But for most of the world, the ancient furnaces have fallen silent. The bronze casting workshops of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the iron foundries of Han China and medieval Europe, these are known through archaeology and text, through the products they left behind, through the reconstructions that scholars attempt. The actual operation has ceased. The actual fires have gone out. The machines that forged empires are no longer running. We imagine the furnace in operation. The charcoal glows beneath the forced air, temperatures rising toward the point where ore transforms. The smith watches the color of the fire, judges the readiness by signs that cannot fully be written down, decides the moment to add the ore, to work the bellows harder, to begin the transformation. The metal emerges, copper or bronze or iron, depending on the era and the ore, and the smith begins the next stage, the casting or the hammering that will shape raw metal into useful form. The heat, the smoke, the noise, the transformation of stone into metal, of ore into tool, of natural material into human artifact. The furnace running was the sound of civilization being built, of technology enabling capabilities that stone alone could not provide. The weapons and tools that emerged from furnaces shaped history, enabled conquests, enabled agriculture, enabled the construction and destruction that define human societies. the furnaces that forged empires, the machines that transformed ore into metal, that converted the energy of fire into the reality of bronze and iron, forever silent in their ancient forms, forever testified to by the artifacts that survive, the tools and weapons and vessels that emerged from fires now long cold, the machines that made history possible, the silence that has claimed them. The Roman watermill at Barbigal was industrial complex as much as machine. 16 water wheels arranged in two parallel rows, each wheel driving a grinding mechanism, the whole system capable of producing enough flour to feed the nearby city of Arles. The scale was unprecedented in the ancient world. The engineering was sophisticated. The purpose was fundamental, converting grain into flour, converting agricultural product into human sustenance, feeding the empire that depended on bread. Grain cannot be eaten as it comes from the field. The kernels must be ground, must be broken down into flour that can be mixed with water and baked into bread. The grinding was labor, endless labor, done by hand in the earliest periods, done with simple querns that required constant human effort, done by slaves who spent their lives in the repetitive motion of pushing stone across stone. The Romans punished criminals by condemning them to the mills. The labor was that unpleasant, that unending, that punishment could take the form of simply requiring it. The watermill transformed this labor, used the energy of falling or flowing water to turn the grinding stones, to automate what had required endless human effort, to free labor for other purposes, or simply to spare humans the drudgery of constant grinding. The watermill was labor-saving device in the most literal sense. It saved the labor that had previously been required, accomplished through water's energy what had previously demanded human or animal muscles. The technology spread across the Roman world. Mills appeared wherever grain needed grinding and water could be harnessed, along rivers and streams, beside aqueducts that could provide reliable flow, in the commercial bakeries that fed urban populations. The characteristic sound of water mills, the creak of wooden mechanisms, the rumble of grinding stones, the splash of water driving wheels, became the ambient noise of Roman industry, the acoustic evidence of technology at work. The Barbegal complex in southern France represents the tradition at its most ambitious. Built in the 2nd century CE, the complex used water from an aqueduct to power 16 overshot wheels. Wheels turned by water falling onto them from above. The most efficient design for the head available. The wheels drove stone mills through gear systems that converted the wheel's rotation into the grinding motion needed for flour production. The output was enormous. Estimates suggest the complex could produce enough flour for 12,000 people, could be the primary food processing facility for a substantial city. The complex was not unique. Industrial scale milling appeared elsewhere in the Roman world, wherever conditions favored concentration of processing. But Barbegal is the best preserved, the most studied, the most eloquent testimony to what Roman engineering could achieve when applied to fundamental human needs. The complex fed people, fed them with technology that ancient peoples might not have imagined, that medieval peoples would not surpass, that represents achievement that often goes unrecognized because grinding grain seems humble compared to building temples. The mills required maintenance. The wooden mechanisms wore and had to be replaced. The millstones wore and had to be dressed, recut to restore the grinding surfaces that use gradually smoothed. The watercourses silted and had to be cleared. The buildings weathered and had to be repaired. The mills ran as long as someone maintained them, fell silent when maintenance ceased. The fall of Rome disrupted the networks that had maintained large-scale milling. The Barbagal complex fell into disuse. The aqueduct that fed it was damaged or neglected. The mechanisms wore without replacement. The buildings collapsed without repair. The complex that had fed thousands became ruin, became archaeological site, became testimony to capability that no longer existed. The mills fell silent, but the technology persisted at smaller scale. Village mills continued operating through the medieval period, continued grinding grain for local populations, continued using water power for the fundamental task of food processing. The tradition did not die, only concentrated, returned to local scale after the imperial scale had become unsustainable. The mills that remained were humbler than Barbigal, but were continuous, were operating, were still running when the Industrial Revolution would eventually transform milling once again. We imagine Barbagal at full operation. The water cascades down the hillside, captured in channels that direct it to the first set of wheels. The wheels turn, their motion transmitted through gears to the grinding stones. The grain flows in from hoppers, is caught between the stones, emerges as flour that flows into sacks below. 16 wheels turning, 16 mills grinding, the whole hillside alive with the motion of water becoming flour. The workers tend the machines, adjusting the flow, monitoring the grinding, bagging the flour, transporting the product to the bakeries where it will become bread. The work is still labor, but it is different labor than the endless pushing of hand querns. The water does the grinding. The humans supervise. The transformation that the mill enables is not only of grain to flour, but of labor itself, from grinding to tending, from muscle to management. The mills that ground grain for empires, the machines that fed populations, that converted water power to food processing, that made urban density possible by automating fundamental production, forever silent at Barbagal, where the ruins testify to what was achieved, forever running in village mills that preserved the tradition through centuries of change, the machines that kept civilization fed, the silence and the continuation, the loss and the persistence, the pattern that defines so much of human technology. Every machine eventually stops. The gears wear, The water ceases flowing, the fire goes out, the mechanism that seemed so permanent, that ran for so long that its running seemed natural, becomes still. The silence that follows, as different from ordinary silence, is absence where presence was, is stillness where motion was, is the end of a rhythm that had become so familiar it was barely noticed until it ceased. We have traveled tonight through many such silences. The gears of the Antikythera mechanism, still for 2,000 years in the darkness of the Aegean, the light of the Pharaohs, extinguished by earthquake after 6 centuries of guiding ships to harbor, the water clocks that measured ancient hours, dry and empty in museum cases, the temple doors that no longer open to fire's heat, the vessels that may or may not have held lightning, ambiguous in their silence, the aqueducts that no longer carry water to Rome, the qanats that still flow, and the qanats that have been abandoned, the tower that no longer tells China the hour, the automata that no longer seem to live, the furnaces that no longer transform ore, the mills that no longer grind grain. Each silence has its own character. Some silences are sudden. The earthquake that toppled the lighthouse, the invasion that dismantled the clock tower, the catastrophes that end operations in moments. Some silences are gradual, the slow wearing that cannot be repaired, the declining maintenance that eventually becomes no maintenance, the fading that ends in stillness through accumulation rather than event. Some silences are complete. The Antikythera mechanism will never calculate heaven again. The Baghdad batteries will never generate current again if they ever did. The furnaces of the Bronze Age will never transform ore again. The technology is lost. The knowledge is gone. The chain of transmission has broken irrevocably. Reconstruction may be possible. Scholars may build replicas that work. But the actual machines, the actual operation, the actual tradition is ended. Other silences are partial. The qanats that still function alongside qanats that have been abandoned. The watermills that continued in villages while industrial complexes fell silent. The traditions that persisted at reduced scale while their grand instantiations were lost. These partial silences are perhaps more poignant than complete ones. They remind us that survival is possible, that continuity can be maintained, that the silence was not inevitable, but was the result of specific circumstances that might have been different. What do the silences teach? They teach that technology is embedded in society, that machines require more than mechanism, require the knowledge to operate them, the resources to maintain them, the institutions to support them. When societies collapse, their technologies often collapse with them, not because the machines themselves fail, but because the networks that sustain them fail. The machine that seems autonomous is actually dependent, is actually part of a system larger than itself, is actually as fragile as the society that created it. The silences also teach that knowledge is not automatically cumulative. The Antikythera mechanism represented knowledge that was achieved and then lost, that was not preserved for later generations, that had to be independently rediscovered after millennia of forgetting. The assumption that progress is inevitable, that later generations will always build on earlier achievements, that knowledge once gained is knowledge forever held. This assumption is false. Knowledge can be lost. Progress can reverse. The silence can descend on achievements that seemed secure. But the silences also remind us that something persists. The machines are silent, but we know they existed. The operation has ceased, but the artifacts remain. The knowledge to operate them is lost, but the knowledge that they existed is not. The silence is not total erasure, is preservation of memory, even when operation has ended. We cannot make the Antikythera mechanism calculate heaven, but we know it once calculated heaven, and that knowledge is itself significant, is itself testimony to human capability, is itself evidence of what was achieved. We sit now with all the silences together, the collection of stopped machines, of ended operations, of technologies that ran and then were stilled, the museums that hold their fragments, the texts that describe their operation, the reconstructions that demonstrate their principles, the archaeological sites where they once stood, now occupied by ruins or by nothing visible at all. The silence is not emptiness, it is full, full of everything that ran and no longer runs, full of all the sounds that were made and are no longer made, full of the accumulated endings of thousands of machines across thousands of years. The silence contains history, contains achievement, contains loss. The silence speaks, in its way, of what it has absorbed, and the silence continues absorbing. The machines that run today will someday be silent. The technologies we take for granted will someday be obsolete or lost. The networks that sustain our complex systems will someday fail, whether through catastrophe or through gradual decline. The silence that claimed the ancient machines will eventually claim ours. The pattern is not ancient history, is ongoing, is future as well as past. What runs in darkness now, unnoticed until it stops? What machines operate in the background of our lives, maintaining conditions we take for granted, performing functions we barely recognize until they cease? The water that flows through pipes, the electricity that flows through wires, the signals that flow through air, all machines in extended sense, all systems that operate continuously and will someday fail. The silence waiting for them is the same silence that claimed the water clocks of Babylon, the same silence that descended on the mills of Barbagal, the same silence that eventually receives all human technology, the silence that falls when machines stop, the stillness that follows the cessation of motion. the absence that defines presence by ending it. Forever the companion of technology, forever waiting at the edge of operation, forever patient, forever inevitable, forever the destination of all machines, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how well maintained, no matter how essential to the civilizations that depend on them. The ancient machines ran in darkness and have been silenced by time. The lesson they teach is not merely historical, but is eternal, that everything stops eventually, that every machine falls silent, that the silence is not enemy, but is simply fact, is the condition that follows operation as night follows day, as rest follows exertion, as ending follows beginning. The silence that falls when machines stop, forever falling, forever receiving, forever the end of the story that machines tell through their operation. The ancient machines have told their stories. The silence holds them now, and somewhere in that silence, something remains. The memory of motion, the echo of operation, the persistent testimony that once something ran here, something worked here, something converted energy to function in the darkness before the silence came. Sleep now. The machines are still. The silence holds them gently, and in the stillness, the history they embodied remains, not lost but transformed, not ended but completed, not silenced but saying, in the only language silence knows, that they existed, that they functioned, that they were part of the long human effort to build and maintain and operate the technologies that make civilization possible. The ancient machines, the darkness, the silence, forever. Conclusion. The echoes that remain. The machines are silent now. The gears do not turn. The water does not flow. The fire is out. The motion has ceased. Across the ancient world, from workshops to temples, from harbors to mountain tops, the devices that once ran have stopped running, have become artifacts, have become mysteries, have become the subject of scholarly reconstruction rather than practical operation. But something remains. The knowledge that they existed, the evidence of what they achieved, the fragments that survive in museums and archaeological sites, the texts that describe their operation even when we cannot fully replicate it, the reconstructions that demonstrate their principles, that prove the ancient achievements were real. The ancient machines tell us something about ourselves, tell us that human ingenuity is ancient, that technological sophistication did not begin with modernity, that our ancestors achieved things we sometimes struggle to replicate. Tell us also that achievement is fragile, that knowledge can be lost, that the chain of transmission can break, that the machines that seem permanent will eventually fall silent. We are surrounded by machines. They hum and click and pulse around us, so pervasive that we notice them mainly when they fail. These machines too will someday be silent, will be artifacts for the future peoples to puzzle over, will be mysteries to be reconstructed, achievements to be marveled at, evidence of what we could do and then could not do anymore. The pattern is not failure, but is simply existence. Everything that operates will eventually cease operating. Every machine will fall silent. The silence is not defeat, but is simply completion, is the end of a period of operation that was always going to end, that was bounded from its beginning. What matters is not whether machines fall silent, but what they achieve while running. The Antikythera mechanism tracked heaven for some period, years, perhaps decades, before it went to the bottom of the sea. The pharaohs guided ships for 6 centuries before the earthquakes brought it down. The water clocks measured time. The furnaces forged metal. The, me- the mills ground grain. For as long as they could, serving purposes that mattered, contributing to civilizations that depended on them. The silence that eventually came does not negate what came before, does not undo the hours measured, the ships guided, the grain ground. The achievement persists even when the operation ceases. The contribution remains even when the machine does not. We honor the ancient machines by remembering them, by studying what they achieved, by understanding the ingenuity that created them, by acknowledging that our own machines are their descendants in spirit, if not in mechanism, that we continue the ancient human project of building devices that extend our capabilities, that convert energy to function, that run in darkness, doing work we depend upon. The ancient machines left running in the dark, the silence that eventually claimed them, the echoes that remain in fragments and texts, in memories and reconstructions, in the ongoing human effort to understand and to build. Sleep now. The journey is complete. The ancient machines rest in their silence, and somewhere in the darkness, something persists. Not sound, but its memory. Not motion, but its trace. Not operation, but its evidence. The machines that once ran, the silence that holds them, the echoes that remain for those who choose to listen. Good night.